Hey guys, Rob here for Beyond the Brush. Today I just want to do a quick sort of overview of the paints that I use and that a lot of people use for painting miniatures. There's three main types of paint. There are enamel paints, oil paints and acrylic paints. For the most part, although you can use enamel and oil paints for painting miniatures, and people do, the majority of paints that you'll come across are acrylics, and these are all acrylic paints. So I'm going to quickly go through sort of the advantages and disadvantages of using acrylic paints. The first advantage is sort of the main one, and that's that they are water soluble, which means that you can thin them with water. You can use water to clean your brushes, and sort of it makes life a lot easier. Whereas with enamel paints and with oil paints, you have to use things like white spirit or turpentine, and sort of nasty, horrible stuff like that just stinks the place out and just generally isn't very nice to use. So that makes acrylics excellent for the kind of use that we're going to have with sort of prolonged exposure and a lot of sort of changing colours and things like that. So here in front of me I've got a fair selection of the different manufacturers that you'll come across. We've got on sort of from this end on, we've got Citadel, which is the Games Workshop paints. We've got Warcolours, which is a manufacturer from, I think it's Cyprus. Could be wrong about that. They're sort of relatively new. We've got the various different bottles of Vallejo. They do game colour and model colour, two different ranges. We have Scale Colour, which is from Scale 75. They brought out a small set of paints. And there is Formula P3, which is the Privateer Press range of paints, which is made not specifically for, but the colours are designed for their War Machine and Hordes games. So, for example, this is Scorn Red. Scorn is one of the factions in the game. Also at the back here we have paints from a company called Life Colour. These tend to be sort of very much for the military modelers, railway modelers, things like that. They tend to produce colours that are sort of specific, so sort of rust effects, dust effects, oil spills, things like that you can sort of duplicate the effect with these paints. They are quite nice paints. They're very, very matte. They come out. There's almost no gloss in them at all, which is lovely. And Tamiya. This is a range of paints from Japan, and they tend to come, again, sort of field grey. They tend to come in military style colours. They have two main ranges of paints. They have the X and the XF, and the only difference is the X is gloss and the XF is flat. Beyond that, they have a fairly large range of paints. These are not great for brushwork, but they are fantastic for airbrush, if you have such a thing. So there's those. But again, these two you're not likely to come across that often in miniature painting. It's mainly going to be sort of this style, and again there are more manufacturers of paints than this. I know in America you can get Reaper. Reaper paints do, Reaper Miniatures do a line of paints, and I think there's various other ones. There's one in France, there's a company in France called Coach d'Armes, which does a set of paints and things like that, and essentially they're all pretty much the same thing. Even including sort of the Life Colour. Tamiya is a bit weird. They use a strange additive. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it makes it doesn't want to mix with other colours. But for the most part, they're all pretty much the same kind of thing. Acrylic paints are made of three different things. You have a binder, which is sort of like, it's a bit like sort of the glue that holds everything together within the paint. You have the pigment, which is the actual colour of the paint and is usually in a powder form, and you have thinner, just to make the paint usable, basically. And that is what makes the paint sort of the colour it is and the consistency it is one of sort of those three those three things in various mixers. And what you'll find is that sort of within different manufacturers, they'll have different color ranges. So the game color range is not designed for any specific miniatures, but it does tend to be sort of brighter than most others. It's more of a sort of fantasy range of colours. Similarly with war colours, they do a sort of quite bright range of colours. Here's one of their oranges. And they're quite nice. The watercolours range, you know, they'll tell you what sort of opacity you can expect on the paint, so how it's going to cover when you actually paint with it. Their colours come in a sets of 5. So this is orange number 4. That's orange number 1. And there we go, there's orange number 5. So you can see sort of, if I got the others out, 1 second. So there's, let's get all these in shot. So there's 1 to 5 of their orange set. So you can see that it sort of works its way sort of down from light to dark. So that's quite a good way of sort of organising your paints, and it gives you a nice sort of range of colours to work from. The good thing about acrylic paints is you can also get sort of metallic colours. So you can see you get a nice shine on these, and again this is a game colour. In this case it's the hammered copper. Yes, nice colour, that one, I do like it. Model colour from Vallejo, that tends to be it's a similar formulation to the game colour, but the model colour range is, well, enormous. I think they're rapidly approaching 300 paints, different colours, and they tend to be more muted, more aimed towards sort of military painters, things like that. So you tend to get sort of more, I think, more realistic colours. I mean, you're unlikely to come across an orange like that in nature without it being sort of, you know, in fire or something, literally sort of in the middle of a fire. You might see an orange like that, but in nature you're not going to. Whereas sort of these kind of colours you're much more likely to find in sort of nature. They're more natural colours, and they also do the military range of colours, so they're sort of specific sort of uniform colours and things like that. Scale colour, they do a range of acrylic that come in sets of, I think it's 8 pods of paint, and they will they have various sort of ranges. So they'll do a flesh set, they do a woodland green set, they do a sort of fire and red set, things like that, and they're very nice. They're variable, I tend to find, the scale colours. They range between really nice or fairly horrendous to use, as with most paints, and that's something I'll come on to in a second. P3, they do a fairly small range of paints, to be honest. I think there's only probably about 60-70 paints in the range, and as I said, they're sort of aimed towards their game. Sort of the colours are very much sort of, these are the colours we've used to paint our studio miniatures, essentially, which is great if that's the game you play. You know, similarly with Citadel, although they do a fairly large range of paints, I think they're probably sort of getting towards north of 200 different colours now, I think, and they've started doing this whole sort of layer base highlight, I think they call it edge, something like that, and things like that, and they actually do an airbrush set as well. I haven't got many Citadel paints, to be honest, so I can't tell you too much, but well, sort of certainly the new ones anyway, so I can't tell you too much about how they sort of work and things like that, mainly because of the cost. As you can see, if you look closely at this, you get 12 mils in a pot, and this costs, you know, sort of depending on your locality, the same, if not more, than something along this lines, which has 17 mil. So you can see you're getting, you know, sort of you're getting significantly more for your money, and same with scale colour. I think that's 17 mil as well. It's sort of the general size of the pot, really. Yeah, 17 mil. I don't know what Formula P3 is. It doesn't. Oh, it does say 18. So just down there, 18 mil. So that's kind of why I don't tend to go for Citadel that much. Is you just don't get much, and I'm not a fan of their pots. I prefer dropper pots like this. The way these work is they have a little tiny dropper, and you can literally put a drop of paint on your palette, and off you go, and sort of put the lid back on. Whereas these and sort of these style of pots, you kind of have to sort of leave open whilst you're using it, or at least sort of like scrape a bit out and put it on your pot, and then sort of try and close it back up again. And they sometimes don't close properly if you're not careful, and it lets air in, and the paint inside the pot cures and things like that. Anyway, all that kind of good stuff. And yeah, I think that's generally about it. I mean, my only advice with paint is that you don't want to try and use stuff like sort of the Anitas or Deco Art, the crafting acrylics like these, mainly because the pigment, the powder that gives it the colour, just isn't fine enough. And what you'll find is if you're painting a large area with these, great, it'll look fine. You know, it's a brown and a green. I use these for terrain, but what you'll find is that they don't give you as fine a finish as proper miniature paints will. These will give you a much smoother, much finer finish on your miniature than you would get with sort of those type of crafting acrylics. That's not to say you can't paint a miniature with crafting acrylics. I've seen it done. But again, it's like paintbrushes, you know. As I said in the paintbrush video, you can paint with synthetic brushes. You can paint with a brush that won't hold a point. You're just not going to enjoy it. It's not going to be a fun process for you, and that's kind of the whole point of, you know, sort of painting miniatures and wargaming and things like that. Is it's supposed to be fun. So yeah. The only other thing I'd say about paints is that they do, you know, sort of, no matter what surface you're putting them on, whether it be plastic, resin or metal, you will need a primer. And this is an acrylic primer. It's by Vallejo and comes in a sort of 200 ml bottle. This is a fairly giant bottle of it. You can get it in bottles like this, but in all honesty, the amount I use, I tend to just buy big bottles because it's, you know, slightly cheaper that way. So what the primer does is it gives you a surface to start painting on, because with plastic and metal miniatures, what you'll find is you'll get a smooth, shiny surface. I can't really show it too well on here, but you can see this is a very, very smooth surface. There's no imperfections in the surface. And I've painted the tops of all of these with the appropriate colour. And I found that what I had to do was, not only did I have to slightly sand the surface to sort of give it a bit of roughness, but I also had to prime the surface so that the paint would stay on. But that does mean that the paint on these bottles will stay on pretty well, which is handy because that's the bit you're touching on a regular basis. So yeah, primer essentially helps with the painting. Again, you don't have to use it, but you're going to get better results if you do. Your miniatures are going to be a lot more hard wearing. They'll stand up to a lot more punishment on the table if it's gaming that you're doing, and things like that. So yeah, it's essentially sort of a bit like brushes. Spend what you can on paint, because you're going to have a much better time of it. And as far as the manufacturer goes, it depends on what you can get in your area. If you can get Games Workshop in your area, which you almost certainly can, they are pretty much ubiquitous. And if that's the only paint that you can get in your area, then that's the only paint you can get in your area. You're going to have to get it. If you've got a choice of maybe sort of some Vallejo and maybe some scale colour, if you've got a sort of half decent shop, or you can go online to a sort of local to your country type shop, then great, job done. Go get some of those. You know, you don't have to stick with a specific manufacturer. You don't have to paint your entire model with Vallejo. You don't have to paint your entire model with Citadel, just by what Games Workshop tell you. you can mix and match the paints to a degree. You can certainly paint one manufacturer over the top of another manufacturer. That's not a problem. What you might find, and you'll need to try this, you just sort of try it out on a bit of card or something like that, is mixing two different manufacturers. As I said earlier, Tamiya tend to put some sort of weird thinner in theirs, and it really just doesn't like mixing with anything else. It's not even a fan of being thinned with water, which is quite unusual for an acrylic paint. You have to use their own thinner, otherwise it just goes really weird and manky. But you know, that's kind of the price you pay for it being absolutely brilliant at airbrushing. But things like I've mixed scale colour with model colour, I've mixed Citadel with game colour, for example, and they tend to mix all right. But you'll find some that just don't, some paints just don't want to mix together. I don't know why. It's the different formulations perhaps, but you'll tend to find that they either go really manky, they'll just go sort of gummy and horrible, or the colours just won't mix properly, and you just end up with a mess, and you just know that sort of, okay, fair enough, I can't mix those two colours together. But beyond that, you know, sort of, if you like this red, get this red. You know, it's more about the colour than the manufacturer. I've got a fairly huge selection of paints. I've probably got a couple of hundred sat in front of me at the moment, and they're all sorts of different colours. I've got all sorts of flesh tones and reds and greens and blues and browns and purples and all sorts arrayed in front of me. And in all honesty, I've just collected paints over the years, and I've got paints from pretty much every manufacturer I can think of, with, you know, sort of major manufacturers, with probably the exception of Reaper, because I'd have to order it from America, and that's just going to cost. You know, it's I've seriously considered it before now. I backed one of the Bones Reaper miniature Kickstarters, and they had an offer to get some paint as one of the stretch goals, I think it was, or sort of one of the add-ons. And I seriously considered adding it in and saying, yeah, I want a load of paint just to try it out. And then it occurred to me, it's sort of like, well, yeah, but the problem is if I like it, I can't get any more without spending a fortune on shipping and import tax and what have you. So there's no point. So it essentially comes down to, what can you get in your country? You know, you will see people painting beautiful miniatures with Citadel. You'll see people painting beautiful miniatures with Vallejo, with scale colour, with P3, with watercolours, you know, with life colour, Tamiya, everything. You'll see people painting beautiful miniatures with whatever paint. And that's the thing, is there is no perfect manufacturer. You know, I should know, I've got 5 arrayed in front of me, well, 7 arrayed in front of me right now, and there is no perfect manufacturer. Life colour, absolutely brilliant, beautifully matte paints, terrible range of colours. You know, sort of, you wouldn't want to paint, these are for effects. Tamiya, brilliant airbrush paints, absolutely fantastic airbrush paints. If you want to paint plastic tanks, excellent. Miniatures, yeah, they do okay colours, but in all honesty, not really. Citadel, yeah, they do perfectly serviceable paints. I haven't really bought into their sort of layer, base and highlight range at all, and sort of, I think they do dry brush and washers and all sorts of stuff these days, because in all honesty, it's just too expensive for what it is. Watercolours, I bought their entire base range. I've got something like 100 odd paints from them, and they're really nice paints. There's some in there that are fairly terrible, and there's some in there that are excellent. It's the same with any range, which brings me on to another subject, and that's the coverage that you'll get out of paints. What I've done with these bottles is I've put a primer on the bottle, and then sort of the light grey primer that I showed you earlier, and then 3 coats of paint with a brush. So as you can see, this bottle got pretty good coverage. It's a bit dusty, so it's got pretty good coverage. You know, there's a few spots here and there, but beyond that, it's pretty much all right. Again, this one, the same. You know, it's not bad coverage. You know, there's no sort of spots on it you can really see. This one, on the other hand, you can see, or possibly see, that there are places on the bottle cap where it has not covered. There are bits where you can see the primer through it, and that's because of the coverage of the paint. It's essentially the ratio of the pigment to the binder to the thinner. If there, for whatever reason, isn't enough pigment in a paint, then you're not going to get the coverage, because it's the pigment that gives you the colour. The binder and the thinner are essentially transparent. So it's the pigment that gives you the colour. And bright colours, pure colours, are notorious for having a very difficult, having sort of really bad coverage. So, for example, here's one of the sort of bright greens. It's a really deep green, and you can see on the cap it's not covered at all. That's 3 coats of paint, and it just hasn't covered. And it even says, I mean, to be fair to them, it even says translucent. So you're not going to use that for base coating. You just can't. It would take you so many coats of paint to get that to cover. But what you can do is use it to tint other colours. So sort of you put one colour down and then put this over the top of it, and it gives it a slight green tint. Whereas, you know, sort of other colours like sort of the greys and things like that cover beautifully. Again, 3 coats, same kind of paint, same manufacturer, it's just down to the colour. And this happens with any range of paints. I'm just looking through my collection at the moment. Yellows tend to be fairly bad, so here's a model colour. They're usually known, you know, sort of model colour are pretty much known for having fairly good paints. But again, here's a paint that just hasn't covered that well. Again, 3 coats, just really hasn't done the job. Reds tend to be fairly bad as well. Here's a game colour. I went a bit overboard on the spray, but it's a game colour, and you can see sort of it's patchy. Yeah, it's a usable paint. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a bit patchy, and you'll get that with virtually all the paints. You know, sort of game colour do some excellent paints. They look fantastic in the pot. You know, sort of luminous yellow. Doesn't cover for toffee. Absolutely, just does not cover for toffee. And this wasn't just sort of like I shook it for a little bit and put a couple of coats on. This was I got a pin in, and I literally got a bit of metal and properly stirred this paint around to make sure it was all mixed together, and just doesn't cover. But that's the nature of paints. Sometimes you will get a paint that is able to cover, and sometimes you won't. And it tends to be the colours specifically. So it's not so much that you'll get a bad bottle of paint. That may happen on occasion, but it's pretty rare, to be fair. But it's more the colour of the paint. So getting a yellow paint is usually a nightmare. Getting a sort of bright deep green paint like the emerald one I showed you is a nightmare. Bright reds are usually a nightmare. Most of the ones I've got here are fairly good, but you know, sort of those kind of colours. Blues tend to be okay, browns tend to be okay. It's sort of the more muted colours, you know, that's not a bright colour. It's what we'd call sort of desaturated. It's got a lot of different colours mixed into it. It's not a sort of pure colour, whereas this is more of a sort of pure colour. So it has much more difficulty covering, and that's not down to the manufacturer. You know, sort of the wall colours, oranges don't particularly cover very well. Neither do the game colour oranges or the model colour oranges. The only way you're going to get an orange that covers particularly well, like this one, is if it's mixed with other colours. So you can see this is actually quite a sort of, it's almost a sort of very red orange. So it's got a lot of different pigments mixed into it. It's also in their 1 coat range, so it's supposed to be highly opaque. But if you look at their actual orange, so say for example sort of orange 5 is listed as semi-opaque. So you can see on here, you know, it's covered pretty well, but there are definitely areas where, you know, sort of it could be better. And to be honest, I did this deliberately. I deliberately did 3 coats because I wanted to see sort of how well they covered over the 3 coats. So all of the bottles I've got in front of me have 3 coats of paint on, and that is a very deliberate thing. I haven't sort of gone over and gone, oh well, that's not covered properly, I'll need to put some more on. It is so that I can look at the paint sort of as it's sitting in my shelf and go, okay, that's not going to cover too well. I don't want to use that as a base coat, but I could use it as a mix or a tint or something along those lines. So I think that pretty much about covers it, really. I can't think of anything else that needs to be said about paints. So yeah, I think that's it, really. We'll cover sort of more in-depth paint-related things, like sort of colour theory and sort of things like that. It's not something I've been taught, but I've kind of sort of learnt it myself from sort of other people's videos and things I've read on the internet, and sort of little bits of research I've done myself. So we'll cover a bit of that, and sort of more detail of obviously sort of how to use these to actually put them on a miniature, and we'll cover that later on. But for the moment, I think that's good. All right, cheers guys, I'll see you.